That's a good question, Steve. I haven't really thought about that. I mean, it's a public record. That if it's legislative business, it's a public record. I mean, if I'm going to the doctor, I don't have to give you that.
Right.
Or if I'm, meeting my wife for lunch. But the rest is a public record. So.
I'm thinking of two of your predecessors who come to mind, Dan Webster for one, Alan Benz for another, who would post it outside the office door in the morning, so that, if there's a delegation of Pasco County citizens up here, it would be beneficial if we knew about it.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, Steve. I'm open to that.
Hey, could you speak to the role, Speaker, of consultants under these new rules? You have new rules governing the behavior of lobbyists. For laymen back home, they don't realize, I think, to a large extent, consultants have an outsized role in the process as well. What will life be like for them going forward?
Well, first of all, I think where most of the consultants, there's two areas where they have tremendous influence over legislators. One is when they're also lobbyists. So they literally, they're consigliaries during a campaign or during a tough fight, and then they just morph right over and they become a lobbyist. So they're covered under all those new rules that we did in that capacity. The other one is in just campaign world, and what I've said to people in the past is we just got started. We just got sworn in today. Trust me, there'll be a lot more reforms coming down the pike that will deal with the campaign world.
Speaker, we've heard a lot from...
Which I don't know everybody, so I apologize.
I'm Jessica Bakeman from Politico.
Okay,
Florida.
nice to see you. I
We
know I
heard-
met you, I just couldn't remember names.
That's okay. Hopefully you'll remember me soon. We've heard a lot from now Senate President Negron about his goals for higher education. So I'm just wondering if you also share his goals for boosting the public universities, or if you're open to investing the kind of money that he's talking about investing in the system.
I'll try to remember three aspects to that. First, and anytime you guys ask me about any policy, I'll say this today. We also are trying to transform and move away from a top-down system in the House. And so what we have done, and we've sent out emails and we've sent out memos, is we've told everybody that I will choose the leadership team. That's the people I choose. And then those folks will choose the people that will, in essence, work for them as subcommittee chairs and sit on their committees. And so all of those types of things, for me to say where I stand, I think what we're going to try to get beyond that and let it be much more of a corporate decision-making process. I have been on record as saying two things about that, though. One is a lot of what Joe's talking about, I support. A lot of it the governor supports, expanding Bright Futures through the summer. I think those are all common sense reforms. The final thing I'd say is the budget, I think, is going to be difficult. I think once we see the Zika effect in our sales tax revenues, my hunch is that when we hit session in March, that we're going to be pretty, at best, flatlined, and at worst, we could have a deficit. And so for anything that anybody wants to do on either side, they're going to have to go in and they're going to have to find cuts. And what we have said over and over and over is that we are convinced, even without that being the reality, that we have a spending problem in the state. And so we're going to address that spending problem. So I think if I was a strategist moving forward, and there's something that I thought I would like to get funding for in the budget, my next step would be thinking what is in the budget that's wasteful that I can cut so I can find that funding.
As a related follow-up, what about K-12 funding? You guys have in the past few years touted record funding. Do you hope to continue increasing funding to record levels?
I think that the same scenario applies for K-12 funding. You're going to have to find that money. But yeah, I think K-12 is I think on the K-12 side, I would say for me personally, I'm much more focused on the K-12 side than I am on the higher ed. But I think Joe has some tremendous ideas.
Well, while we're on education, you spoke today about challenging the Democrats to push the FEA to drop the suit. Understanding what you said earlier about policy, would you at least be receptive to further expansion of the tax credit scholarship program? Is that something y'all are going to be looking at the next couple of years?
I think any way that we can force more innovation, more risk-taking, more competition in our educational environment, all the studies suggest that's what gives you a better outcome with the students. And if you guys have studies that suggest that kind of competition produces worse results, then we'll certainly evaluate that study, but they don't exist.
What needs to happen for Senator
Negron's priority for building an Everglades reservoir.
You see, you guys are so conditioned and trained. You really are, and so are we. So I don't fault you. Here's what I would say about people saying that about me, saying that about Senator Negron, President Negron. There's 160 legislators, and we got to move past. This is a speaker priority. This is a Senate president priority. They ought to be corporate priorities of both chambers, and they ought not be, constantly referred to as President Negron wants these priorities and Speaker Corcoran wants these.
So you don't know yet.
That's a broken system.
You don't know yet how it's going to work.
Yeah, you never do. Nobody does. I don't know if any single presiding officer stood before the first I don't know that you guys have even had press conferences like this after organizational session. The reality is this is a ceremonial day. You got all your family in. Everyone's having a good time. Everyone's saying things are going to be great. But there is not a single person in the history of the legislature who could predict what it's going to look like come May, whatever it is, at this point in time.
Mr. Speaker,
I would say I'm encouraged, though. I say this all the time. I think that there is, vast differences between the House and the Senate. We're very, very conservative. You can see that just in the rules and how it's going to play out over the next 2 years. But what I would say is that I think that Senator Negron, he has always behaved, in my opinion, as a great statesman, and he's a great communicator. That's why he's the Senate president. And so I think.
What do you think about that idea of buying land south of Lake Okeechobee?
Did you just? I said any policy question, I would tell you that all of that we'll evaluate. But there's a budget issues on those evaluations. We're going to wait to put together our entire team, all our subcommittee chairs. I mean, that's where it starts. Something like that would start at a subcommittee level. We don't even have subcommittee chairman yet. We don't even know who's on that committee.
Why don't we ask a question about something you already did, which is the rules today? And so, in regards to the rules that you put in place related to especially the budget process and everything like that, are you creating the situation where you are going to create a stalemate and an impasse because you are making it very difficult to have compromise during the final day?
This is how I'd answer that, Gary. Compromise can be a good thing, and compromise can be a bad thing. And so what we are saying by those rules changes, we're open to compromise and trying to figure out a way to get done. Gridlock, in essence, doesn't help anybody unless it's gridlock over something that is a diametrical opposition to the principles that would make society, Floridians, or the nation great. That's not gridlock, that's statesmanship. And so yeah, if we get to the end of the budget and the Senate wants to put into conference something that could or was not filed on the beginning of session in the House by one of 120 members, then there's going to be there'll be difficulties in that moment, and I'm sure we'll deal with them.
But as a follow-up to that, what if the Senate were to say to you, look, we are constitutionally elected officials as well, and we have a different process, and we have a prerogative to advocate on behalf of our constituents, and basically your rules have made it to the point, well, no, unless you've gotten it, complete buy-in from day one of the session of the House, it's a no-go.
That's not true. First of all, part of the concept for the idea, which I think is in general a good rule, is the Senate has a rule, unlike the House, that says that if we send over a substantive piece of legislation and it wasn't filed in the Senate, that they pretty much put it in the trash can. So go back and look. And in fact, not this year, they liked the rule so much they took it out of just in the paragraph and they made it a separate rule and a separate number themselves this year. So they have that. There's no such thing as a piece of legislation that's going to pass in the Senate unless we get one of 40 people to file that bill in the Senate. All we're doing is applying the same rules that have applied for umpteen years since the 1968 Constitution that said this is how you pass a substantive bill, and now we're saying that's how you pass a project in the budget. And keep in mind, Gary, we're talking about projects, we're talking about earmarks, we're talking about pork belly fat. We're not talking about stuff that makes the trains run on time.
I wanted to get you to follow up on another rules-related thing. What you did not include and that you had talked about in the past is putting a fundraising ban on members during committee week. Can you talk about why you chose not to change that and why it's okay for members to be raising money at the same time they're coming up here for substantive policy?
Here's how I'd answer that, Mary Ellen, is first of all, in my 6 years of being elected, I've never had a fundraiser during committee weeks, not one. Now, is my name on other people's fundraiser because I'm in leadership? Yes, it is. But me personally, for personal convictions, have never had a single fundraiser during committee weeks since being elected. So obviously I believe that that's a good policy. But what we have before us, nobody's arguing, are the most historic, transformational, accountable, open, transparent, reining in behavior rules in the nation. And if you got, yeah, that's what I'm politely saying.
Representative
But honestly, but I don't want to. Then your follow-up question is, well, why did that one lose? You know, and I don't want to. Honestly, I think that to be able to sit down with my colleagues, to be able to sit down on the Republican side, to be able to sit down with my colleagues on the Democratic side, and get to where we got. And sure, maybe some got. You know, if it were up to me, I would have banned outright lobbying for local governments. I would have said you cannot lobby the legislature whatsoever if you're getting paid by taxpayer dollars by any governmental entity. Now, what we ended up with, it was still great. Now, once we amalgamate all that information, because now we just say you have to disclose the contract. If you give us that contract, then you can lobby. And now we'll have all these contracts of all these governmental entities, and hopefully coming soon is the top 10 list of everything you can imagine. Top 10 biggest spenders, top 10 lobbyists who get taxpayer money, top 10 county commissioners who let lobbyists do their job because they stink. All of that's coming soon. Well, what I would have done, though, was an outright ban, and that will be in legislation.
Can I ask you this on that point? You speak very, very highly in your remarks today about the tax credit scholarship program, maybe not directly, but aspirationally anyway. That program's efforts to try to get the teachers' union to drop the suit has been one of the most heavily funded, financed television campaigns you've ever seen, on a policy issue. Would you like to see, in your drain the swamp ideas, would you like to see some kind of limits put on an organization like Step Up for Students, which seems to have enough money diverted from taxpayer dollars to finance this kind of campaign? Is that wrong in your view?
Well, no, with all due respect, you've mixed a bunch. First of all, they don't get any money. They're an organization that disperses money. That money goes to schools.
It's tax money
that goes to schools. That goes to schools. I think they are capped statutorily somewhere in the ballpark of 5 or 6% for administrative overhead, and that's it. But the reality is, there's also constitutional issues. We have no authority under the Constitution, which I would stand and defend at any point in time, to shut down people's right to speech and right to engage in the political process to say something, let alone something that is as disgusting and as repugnant and as evil as what this teachers union is engaging in. The fact that you have these children who are dying to get out of a failing factory and go to a place where they have an opportunity and hope for a real life and a real possibility at doing something great with themselves, and you have these people trying to destroy that, is it's one of the lowest marks of any special interest group I've been familiar with ever. And so to the extent that there's $18 gazillion fighting crazy people like that, have at it. Have at it.
Can I ask you about that? First of all, you just talked about constitutional right. Isn't it the union's constitutional right to challenge the law if they think it's unfair?
Yeah, but did I ever challenge their constitutional right to challenge a law they were saying unfair? My point was that on common sense, on studies, on every possible metric, what they're defining as fair is not fair. That's some subjective, crazy-ass notion that they have that is completely false.
And then the follow-up is...
But they still have that right. I'm not taking that right away from them.
So, a lot of Democrats have praised, you've been bipartisan, they feel like it's very open, but your rhetoric, particularly towards the teachers and teacher unions, is very strong. How does that foster a sense of openness and collegiality if you're coming so hard?
My rhetoric isn't against anybody. My rhetoric isn't against lobbyists. My rhetoric isn't against members. My rhetoric isn't against the union. My rhetoric is for truth. And if it's true, and that is a knowable thing, that is an objective thing, then you fight for that truth. And if you don't, I think, why are you even in this process? So yes, am I passionate about that which I know is true? Am I willing to compromise and work on solutions with the minority party, as I was just asked? Absolutely. And did we sit down and break bread and have all kinds of conversations? Did I get everything I wanted? Obviously I didn't. Did Chairman Oliva, did the Republicans? No. That's good compromise. Bad compromise is when you're violating your principles that you know will lead to a worse environment, a worse legislature, a worse outcome in education, a worse outcome in healthcare. If you're just going to capitulate to the special interests and the mainstream media and all the powers that be because you're afraid or somehow it's not worth the fight on something that you know fits that definition, then there's nothing honorable about that, and there's nothing dogmatic about that.
Mr. Speaker, in light of the Sanibel police officer being shot yesterday and more increasing attacks against police officers, there are some folks starting to call for making attacks on a police officer a hate crime. I wonder, is that something that you think?
I haven't looked at that. We'll have to look at that.
Speaker, going back to the budget process real quick, you talked about some of the, you've been involved in the process for a long time. You talked about some of the, I don't know, incidences in the past that maybe led you to that. Obviously, everyone knows about the budget, the sprinkle lists and everything in the last few years, but there was also the Taj Mahal, and that you were really involved with that, and it got into the budget later on, related to the process, and you've always defended that. So I'm wondering if you still do, and how those, your experiences being, as a pretty good insider, led you to this, transformational reform.
Well, first I'd say I wasn't involved at all in the Taj Mahal, and the facts bear that out. I had resigned and wasn't even here when that was passed. I had left long before that. Number two is I have not defended the Taj Mahal. In fact, last year or the year before, I had an entire committee meeting dedicated to the egregious behavior of bureaucrats building buildings that are far too expensive and defy any kind of rational correlation to the commercial sector and the private sector, where they don't have taxpayer dollars that they can act like is monopoly money and go out there and spend $450 a square foot on a building. And so I had an entire committee meeting showing the disgrace of the cost of the Taj Mahal, and then I told you guys all the outrage, every article you guys wrote about the Taj Mahal, and since then we have broken the Taj Mahal. There's the Taj Mahal 2, even more expensive, $100 more per square foot in the 4th DCA. And we have the Taj Mahal 3 renovations to the DCA court in Miami-Dade. We have the next year I had Chair Frezin do an entire presentation on classroom K-12 buildings. So while our local school boards and superintendents scream poverty, they have no problems building $25, $50 million buildings, which absolutely are inexcusable. And all that money is money that is drained from paying great teachers salaries they deserve, from putting more money in the classrooms. And so those are the two aspects to the Taj Mahal point. Great, but I would say that, but the stuff that you see in this process, yeah, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. I don't know how you guys don't see it. I mean, it's everywhere. There's 19 more thousand things that I think that we could do. I don't want to discourage good people from running for office, so I'm very careful not to try to float that line and I think my colleagues are very careful to do that analysis. But yeah, I mean, come on, all you have to do is go across the street in the last 2 weeks of session and see people writing stuff, and all you get is a name, a line item, and an amount.
You just conflated the PICO money with the FAST money, which some school administrators would say they.
That was all PICO. I didn't talk about the FEFP at all.
Okay.
All of
You
that is
said
PICO.
it's taking away from paying, you don't pay teachers with PICO money, right?
No, yes, no. A budget is a finite number. Our budget's $82+ billion. If I take this $2 billion over here from the LATF, and I take that $1 billion and I move it over here, or I increase this pot over here, that's less for this pot over here. You're right. They're all separate pots. But whatever you spend in this pot, why do you think we argue about bonding them every year? Why do you think? Because that grows those pots, and then you got to come back and you got to do it again the next year and the next year. And people and subsequent leaders don't want to be able to have all their money already tied up in these pots, because once you start a PICO project, you almost have to finish a PICO project.
So I guess I'm just trying to ask you the big picture. What are your thoughts on the funding formulas and the guidance that you'd like to give your leaders about reevaluating that stuff. Is it gonna look the same? Would you like it to get more examination as to whether all the PICO money should stay as construction money, or should that be merged with other?
And I've said it a ton of times, and I think all my colleagues would echo the same thing. The problem in K-12 education is not funding. The problem in K-12 education is we stifle innovation, we don't take risks, and we fight competition at every turn. And we have level after level after level of bureaucracy that's not helping our children. And so the more that we can get, and again, study after study, you guys can Harvard just came out with an absolute in-depth study that talked about the benefit in Boston and Massachusetts of just having a charter school in the environment of a public charter in the same place as a public county school, and what it did to both schools. These are study after study after study, and that's what we have to do. We have to innovate. We have to take risks. We have to institute more competition. We have to bring in great teachers. We have to pay those teachers the real dollars, and there's enough money in the system. Which is why you go back, Mary Ellen. Which is why another thing the teachers union fights to the death. Okay, we care about teachers and we care about children. But when we had a proposal that was making steam in this process 10 whatever years ago that said, okay, let's do this. Let's mandate that 65% of every single dollar has to go straight to the classroom. Guess who fought us?
Mr. Speaker,
You want to guess? No one wants to guess? Go ahead, Steve.
my question is about lobbyists and lobbying. That is, if members of the House Republican caucus invoking your name not just solicit money from lobbyists, but do things like solicit lobbyists to come down and walk precincts for members. That goes on all the time. It's been going on all the time. Do you make distinctions between certain kinds of relationships and activity that goes on between lobbyists and members, or is it all suspect in your mind?
No, there's two different worlds. There's the public world with public tax dollars, and in that public world with public tax dollars, you recognize that there is a lines going to them, but then there's the right of the parties who have a platform, and that platform says these are the principles that we believe, and these are the principles we're going to fight for. The other party has their own principles. The mainstream media prints papers. People mail out mail pieces, and so you raise money to get out your platform, and you recognize a lot of the money that's raised over here are people that play over here in the public sector. But this is a protected private sector behavior. This one is absolutely sacred, and so you have to try to figure out a way to make those work. But the first thing you do is you make this sacred, and it's been so because of those lines. It's been so gradually over time has eroded a lot of those great statesman aspects to our institution. So we got to figure out ways to do that. Over here, we need to deal with it constitutionally in a probably more in a campaign-related area than we do, because we don't have the right. I don't have the right to say, teachers union, show me all your donors, or do this with your mail pieces, or don't do that with your mail pieces.
A quick follow-up, and that is you're bifurcating this as though they're two separate entities.
No, I've said very clearly there's lines going between both, even though they are separate. One is public with public dollars, one is private with private dollars. That being said, that there's absolutely, again, lines that go back and forth between the two. And what has happened is the lines going back and forth between the two over these last 30 years, I will tell you, has had an absolute inimical effect on the sacred public trust institution. And so that's what we're trying to figure out, is how to balance that and restore that back to its proper place. I got one more. I got time for one more. I apologize. All right, I'll do two.
Speaking in general terms about the budget, the last projection shows that you have about $7.5 million. Senate President Negron is a bit more optimistic. Based on what you said earlier about Zika and the impact on sales tax, it sounds like you might not be. What's your sort of outlook? What do you think?
Yeah, well. First of all, the $7.5 million was at our last revenue estimating, the last revenue estimate conference. They presented to our LBC, and I think and I'll just give you an example of why that's a fictional number. First of all, it calculated managed care rates. I want to say at 7%. They came in at 9% 2 weeks later. it calculated not making a significant change in the rate of return on our pension program. We're not getting close to our rate of return on the pension program. We're going to have to drop it. That's hundreds of millions of dollars. It did not calculate that last year we cut the RLE. And when I say cut the RLE, we paid for it. So this year, if we're not going to also do that again, which was several hundred millions of dollars, then you're going to be de facto raising people's property taxes. So it didn't account for that. It also took Triumph funding, which is technically a pass-through that goes straight out to the affected counties, and counted that in the bottom line. You add all of that up, even the $7.5 million quote-unquote balance that we had 2 months ago. Even then, just looking at the numbers, I can tell you we were more like, in my estimation, we were probably more between $500 and $1 billion in the hole.
What about state employees? Any chance that they get a pay raise next year?
I think Senator Latvala has mentioned that's one of his top priorities. And again, it's going to be one of those things where we go through and look at the funding and the priorities and figure out if there's money there for that. It's very expensive. So if you're looking at a $500 to $1 billion deficit, which we'll find that out, we'll know more sooner. A pay raise for state employees is normally in the ballpark of anywhere from, it depends on how low you do it. If you just do a 1% bonus or something versus you do a 3% pay raise, you're talking anywhere from $50 to $250 million.
Speaker, one of the things you do have to do this year is deal with Amendment 2, and you have this existing system set up. I know you don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of policy, but given that you've been so overtly positive about free market ideology, what kind of principles do you want to see put into a system regulating medical marijuana in Florida?
All I'd say on that is that we're going to honor the will of the voters. We're going to protect the Constitution, and we're going to protect the people of the state of Florida. What that looks like, obviously, all the other principles that we have espoused in other areas, Michael, I think we've been consistent about those from day one. I don't think that's going to change. I really have. I have family. Otherwise, I would do longer. But I have family. Most of them flew in from Washington D.C. So I appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.